game of Warhammer 40k is sometimes overwhelming with how large it is. There are an insane number of possible factions to play, and if someone is not only new to 40k, but also new to tabletop gaming in general, then learning how to start can be a daunting task. If you are in this camp, this video is for you. Welcome to GC Studios' How to Play Warhammer 40k, the series. Episode 2, Which Faction is Right for You? Realistically, this will actually be episode 2.1. Because there are so many factions, we will have to split this video up into a couple different parts. In the first part, we will cover the factions under the heading the Imperium of Man. In part 2, we will cover the factions under the heading Chaos. And in the third part, we will cover the factions under the heading Xeno. So let's begin. We will start simply and move on from there. The first faction to be covered will be the Astra Militarum, or the Imperial Guard. The Imperium of Man has conquered countless planets. There are so many worlds under their control that even they forget how powerful they are. In order to hold and protect these thousands of worlds, the Imperium needs brave men and women to hold the line. This mighty responsibility falls on the shoulders of the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Guard is comprised of normal men and women carrying rifles and digging trenches to defend their homes. Any single one of them would be hopelessly outmatched, and so to win wars, they come in thousands. Tanks, artillery, orbital bombardments, and a good old-fashioned World War I trench-sitting gun line is a daily reality for the average Imperial Guard. These poor souls go up against demons, giant mech suits, and horrific aliens, but with courage and faith, they hold the line. Against the ever-growing shadow, they hold the line. For 10,000 years, they have held the line. On the tabletop, the Astra Militarum is what you would typically call a horde army. If you wish to bring them in the game, you will have dozens, if not 100 models on the table. Although we will go through the process of actually building an army list later, I will touch on the points now to start giving some context to the factions in this video. Most 40k games are played with 2,000 points per army. At the time of this recording, the normal Imperial Guard infantry unit is 120 points per 20 models. You can bring a maximum of 6 of the same units in the army, and so you can bring up to 120 infantry models of Imperial Guard for 720 points. Over 100 models, and you aren't even halfway through building an army. If you wish to play Imperial Guard, you will have to paint a lot of models. A lot of models. The Imperial Guard way is to drown your opponent in hundreds of bodies and a ludicrous amount of firepower. The common infantry squad will carry 17 lasguns. At 12 inches away, they fire 2 shots. While lasguns are laughably weak, you are firing 34 shots, one of which is bound to strike home. Tanks and artillery are offered in spades to support the foot troops. The two main drawbacks of playing the Guard are, number one, that none of your individual units are usually very good, and so it is usually only through superior numbers that you win. And two, in the real world, you have to buy so many models to make this army work, and honestly, it ends up being one of the most expensive armies to build as a result. Going back to the 120 models example, the typical infantry squad is sold in sets of 10, meaning to bring 6 full squads, you would have to buy not 6, but 12 model kits. And again, that doesn't even make up half an army. If the playstyle of overwhelming your opponents with sheer rate of fire and overwhelming numbers, if that looks inviting, Then look into the Imperial Guard. The next faction that will be covered is the Adeptus Custodes, otherwise known as the Space Marines. No matter how brave and stalwart the Imperial Guard, there will always, inevitably, be threats that they are no match for. In situations like this, the Space Marines are called upon. Genetically altered transhuman super warriors, the Space Marines, given the nickname the Emperor's Angels of Death, descend as strike teams with brutal tactics and lethal efficiency. The Space Marines come in various groups called chapters. Each chapter is descended from one of the Emperor's own sons, known as the Primarchs. The DNA of these legendary warriors, these demigods, is taken and added to human beings that undergo mechanical and biological enhancing trials, and the result are warriors of uncalculable destruction. As far as the tabletop goes, it's a little hard to narrow down Space Marines into a single type of army. First of all, because in the lore they are just so versatile, and second of all, because the company that makes Warhammer, Games Workshop, Space Marines are their most lucrative selling models, and so they try to make them as marketable as possible. In short, it would be fair to say that Space Marines are more of an elite army than a horde army. I should stop for a moment and explain these terms. If it wasn't obvious by the names alone, I'll clarify that in tabletop wargaming, a horde army is one which relies on an overwhelming number of models rather than the overall strength, skill, or abilities of any one given model. An elite army, by contrast, is typically brought with a smaller number of models, but each one is either very strong, very durable, or has abilities which become critical as the game goes on. Space Marines land in something of a sweet spot where you can bring regular infantry, and you can actually bring quite a number of them. However, the vast majority of the models in the Space Marine lineup are more expensive, and as a result, more powerful. This fact tends to put them more on the elite side, certainly more elite than Imperial Guard at least. To help put this into context, let's return to that basic infantry squad example I used with the Imperial Guard. As a quick reminder, it was discussed again that, at the time of recording, a set of 20 Imperial Guard infantry models would cost 120 points. In contrast, the regular Space Marine infantry, known as the Intercessor Squad, can only come in a maximum group of 10, and if you wish to bring 10 of them, it will cost you 160 points. If you wish to bring the maximum number of these units, it would cost your army a total of 960 points. That means it is just shy of half your entire army, and you will have 60 models on the board. Where the benefit of smaller numbers of models comes in is the fact that each model in the Space Marine army is designed to be worth at least 2 of the Imperial Guard. The Intercessor Squad can fire 2 shots, even at a distance of 24 inches away, as well as their guns being stronger and having the ability to penetrate enemy armor. 2 factors that the Imperial Guard las guns do not. Along with this, you will be able to bring mechanical war walkers known as dreadnoughts, devastating speed bikes, and tactical stealth units known as the Phobos. If you wish to stand your ground and play as a bulwark, you can bring Space Marines in Terminator armor. Terminator armor turns an already supreme strength and toughness of a Space Marine into a veritable walking, living tank. And if you want to be fast and zip across the battlefield with insane speed and strike your opponent before they can prepare, you can just bring jetpack troops and drop them in from the sky. When it comes down to it, it's very difficult to summarize into a single category the abilities or design of Space Marines again. They're just too versatile. And not just are they versatile in the models and units that they have, but the army itself is also split up into such different chapters. Remember that Space Marines in the lore are separated into these chapters, these groups of Space Marines. And in the lore, each chapter has their own philosophy of war. In the tabletop, this is represented by you being able to run your Space Marines in a number of different detachments, representative of these various chapters. If you wish to buff your units so that they can stand still and overwhelm their opponents with the number of shots, there's a chapter detachment you can bring your army in that is just that. If you want to speed across the battle and unleash fire and bathe your opponent in the blazing promethium, then there's a detachment for that. If you want to ride in transport carriers and then surge onto the battlefield swinging swords for the glory of the Emperor, there is a detachment for that. In short, if I was to summarize the way Space Marines play, is pick a playstyle of your choice and there's a detachment for that. Now, I mentioned some drawbacks for playing the Imperial Guard, and I'll do the same with Space Marines. Well, because you can bring a good number of Space Marines, it is still entirely possible that you'll spend a pretty penny building an entire army. Unless, of course, you choose specifically to go after the most elite units of Space Marines in their catalog. But I'm gonna be honest, other than that, there's not much of a downside to playing Space Marines. When it comes right down to it, this is the flagship faction. This is the faction that the company, Games Workshop, tends to put the biggest focus and biggest rewards to. As a result, when you look at marketing, if you were to just type Warhammer 40k into Google in the search bar and go to the images, I can almost guarantee you will find an image of a Space Marine, most likely in blue armor. As a result, it is unfortunate almost that Space Marines tend to get a lot of love and a lot of attention. And I'm saying this as someone who likes playing Space Marines. When it comes down to it, there's very rarely a downside to bringing the Emperor's Angels of Death, because this is what makes the company most of their money, and so they want to make sure they're always marketable. The next faction we are going to look at are the bodyguards of the Emperor of Man. While his body sits upon the golden throne and seeks to protect mankind from the horrors of the galaxy, two groups stand united against all threats that would dare lay their hand against the Emperor. To protect him from all physical threats stand the Adeptus Custodes, and to protect him from all manner of magic stand the Sisters of Silence. Even though this is a two-part faction, it's really only ever referred to as the Adeptus Custodes army. However, there is always the ability to bring Sisters of Silence models along with the larger model range of the Custodes. These two factions work well together in the lore, and are designed to benefit one another in their task of defending the Emperor and the wider Imperium from grave dangers. When it comes to talking about elite armies and elite factions, this is the elite of the elite, maybe only outdone by Imperial Knights, which we'll get to later. Each of the Custodes in the lore is worth 10 Space Marines. The Custodes are the best of the best. They are the fastest and the strongest, taken as the firstborn males of the elite families of humanity's homeworld, and genetically crafted in test tubes beneath the Emperor's own palace, forged into one-man armies, masters of 10,000 fighting styles, warriors of unflinching resolve and uncalculable skill. The Adeptus Custodes are a brotherhood without peer, and as a result, you can barely bring any of them on the tabletop. Let's go back to that infantry squad example one more time to clarify this. If we were to take a regular Custodian Guard infantry unit at maximum size, we would bring 5 models, and it would cost us 225 points. That's right, just 5 models, yet over 200 points. If you were to bring the maximum number of Custodian Guard, you would bring 30 models and have spent 1,350 points. Over half of your army gone, and only 30 models on the board. If we can compare this back to the 120 models that the Imperial Guard is likely to bring, this at first glance is pitiful. But the way it is supposed to be designed is that each of the Custodians is so powerful that by themselves each individual model can crush dozens of the Imperial Guard before even a single Custode dies. Granted, the tabletop game isn't always perfectly balanced around this concept, and so the Custodian Guard have had a bit of a weird history, either being overpowered or not powerful enough, usually it's the second option, unfortunately. But if what you're looking for is a model range that you don't have to buy a lot of in order to build a full army, and where each and every unit you possess is designed to be an unbeatable powerhouse, you gotta go with the Custodian Guard. And if you wanted to bring a larger number of models to help fill in the ranks and cover those gaps where your enemy might be trying to flank you, you can always bring along some Sisters of Silence. The Sisters of Silence are a rather tragic group. In the world of 40k, there are things called Psykers. These are beings who can summon forth magical powers from the realm of the warp. Psykers are incredibly deadly and incredibly powerful. Even untrained, a Psyker's power can suddenly explode and unleash devastating barrages of lightning and fire. They can destroy entire cities just by having a mental freakout. The Sisters of Silence are known as blanks. A genetic anomaly makes them completely impervious to the warp and its influence and any power drawn from it. Waves of psychically summoned lightning blasts will dissolve into nothing in the mere presence of a Sister of Silence. Demons summoned from the warp will shriek in terror at the mere sight of one of these voiceless armored women. The all-female half of the Emperor's bodyguard stand alongside the Custodes. While not as physically imposing as the Custodian Guard, their ever-present threat makes all servants of the warp and demonkind shudder. Because the Custodians are so physically powerful, one of the only things that truly threatens them are supernatural threats like high-powered Psykers and enormous demonic forces. This is where they rely on strategically placed Sisters of Silence, who at the last moment will move in and use their aura of nullification to weaken the Custodians' opponents. Just the same, when incredibly physically strong and daunting foes appear to strike down a Sister of Silence, she need only take a single step back and the Custodian Guard will move in and dispatch this opponent. On the tabletop, Sisters of Silence do not have a traditional normal infantry model or unit that can appear in excess of 3 total units. You can only bring a maximum of 3 for all types of units besides regular infantry. For the Sisters of Silence, as a comparison, the most infantry-like unit, you can bring 3 sets of them. They are called the Silent Sister Prosecutors, and you can bring a unit of 10, and it will cost you 100 points. Just 10 points per model. It's not a bad way of filling in some of the gaps left when you have this hyper-elite army that leaves you with not a lot of wiggle room. If you choose to play the Adeptus Custodes, there are some detachments that try to exemplify the fact that the Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence work together. Although since between the two of them, Custodes are always more popular, most of the types of detachments and armies you can run are pretty much always centered around just the Custodes, and what they can do, which is everything, in case I haven't made that clear. Now, the main downsides to playing Custodes are, well, there's a few. First, being a hyper-elite army, they are a little hard to balance. If they're too good and each model is truly unkillable, then it's no fun for anyone playing against the Custodian Guard. If it's somewhat balanced, so that the Custodian Guard can reliably be killed by the opponent, well, you can't bring enough of them to make that fun for you. If you are only able to bring 20 models on the board, and an opponent with enough lasgun fire can reliably kill you, well, they've got over 150 models on their side. By the time you reach them, you will have eaten so much firepower, you're probably already dead. Another problem that the Custodes sometimes have is the way the game is designed. Current 40k relies on a number of objectives being taken. Sometimes this means having one of your models stand in a particular part of the board, but other times it requires models to forego attacking an enemy and instead perform some task or action. In this case, if I was playing Imperial Guard, I wouldn't mind, because I've got so many units. I'll just send one to investigate that signal, or whatever I'm supposed to do. But in the case of the Adeptus Custodes, I've got so few units, I can't really risk wasting one's abilities for this turn, just on researching some signal or deploying some teleport homer. None of this is meant to discourage people from playing Custodes, but I'm just trying to be absolutely fair. Hyper-elite armies require a number of careful decisions to be made correctly. If I move an Imperial Guard, or even a Space Marine model, incorrectly, I typically have enough models that I can make up for my blunder. In the case of the Custodes, if I don't make the right move at the right time, or use that right ability in the right time, there's no catching back up. There's no coming back. You've only got one solid chance with an army that's that small to make it count. While the Custodes are one of the cheaper armies to collect because of how few you have to buy, the issues with building a purely elite army, and the far larger problem that Games Workshop has really made some bad choices with their lore recently, makes it a little harder for me to recommend they get picked up, but the elite style of gameplay is what you enjoy, the Custodes are for you. Speaking of elite of the elites, now we get to the Imperial Knights. Oh boy, here we go. The only army more elite, possibly, than the Custodes would be the Imperial Knights. Giant skyscraper-sized war machines marching from battlefield to battlefield with cannons firing bullets the size of minivans and chainsaw sword arms as tall as mountains. And with feet so heavy they cause earthquakes, the Imperial Knights are aesthetically one of the most horrifying things to see on the other side of the tabletop, even if, in-game-wise, they're not always that terrifying. In the lore, these are noble households, warrior lineages passing down the honor of piloting their knights, and when their time has come, they hand it down to their descendant, and so on and so on. Each knightly household has a crest. Each knightly household has a doctrine of battle. Each knightly household has a tradition and a long history of warfare and victory. They each take up various honor codes and seek to uphold them in the middle of battle. From inside their giant war machines, these pilots, physically linked into their knightly bodies, seek to defend the weak, uphold the honor of the Imperium, lay low the evil tyrants of chaos, and free humanity from the enslaving chains of the xeno-filth. Basically, ask yourself this question. Have you ever considered that you might want a story where a knight of Arthurian legend, holding to honor codes of chivalry, was strapped into a 50-foot, scratch that, 100-foot tall, walking metal body, and then aimed a minigun the size of Notre Dame Cathedral and opened fire at a demon the size of the Seattle Space Needle? If any part of that story appealed to you, then you might want to look into the Imperial Knights. In the case of being elite, this army is again the prime example. To use our infantry metric that we've been using to contextualize these armies, if we were to bring the normal, quote-unquote, infantry, quote-unquote, of the Imperial Knights, known as the Armature Helverin, it would cost us 130 points and would earn us one model. That's right. For the minimal cost of 780 points, just slightly higher than 120 guardsmen, we will have 6 models on the board. Your average mainstay Imperial Knight, not the armatures, not these small robots, but the normal, massive knights, will cost you something in the realm of 300 to 400 points. The Knight Paladin, for example, at the time of recording, costs 405 points, nearly a quarter of your available army, and it's just one model. So why would you play the Imperial Knights? After all, it seems like all it does is take the potential negatives I gave to the Custodes and maximize them. And unfortunately, my answer to that, if it was a question, is yes. Here's the thing. Before any Imperial Knight player watches this and decides to rage at me because I'm not praising their models enough, just to be clear, the Imperial Knight models are some of the coolest things in the entire model range of 40k to me. 40k Imperial Knights are incredibly cool to look at, but when it comes to actually playing them, it can be a little bit rough. Or it can be absolutely amazing, but there's usually not an in-between. Imperial Knight weapons are ludicrously strong and ludicrously devastating. But you only realistically will fire maybe 6 or 7 of them a turn. As a result, if you roll well on your turn, where you fire your 7 models on the table at your opponent's army will be easily reduced by a quarter or maybe even a half. But if you don't roll well on the 5 out of 7 of the models you don't have enough models to make up the difference. For example, if I shot with 3 units of guardsmen at an enemy model, I will have fired dozens and dozens of shots, and if I haven't hurt it at all, I will not sweat it even a bit, because I know I've got dozens and dozens more shots to go. But if I've got 5 knights, and I've unloaded everything into one model, and done nothing, sweat will be pouring down my face, because I know I barely have anything left to try to hurt it with. When it comes down to it, the Imperial Knights cost-wise, weirdly, even though the models themselves are expensive, because you have to buy so few of them, it kind of comes around to being one of the cheapest armies to collect. It should just be known that the army tends to be a bit swingy on the board, and by swingy, I mean because you have so few models, if you roll well, you will have some of the greatest games you've ever had and just stomp your opponent into dust. But if you don't roll well for even one singular turn, it can start an avalanche of momentum against you that you can just get stuck in and be unable to dig yourself out of the hole your bad rolls have dug for you. For me, the Imperial Knights are incredibly cool to look at and incredibly fun to play, both for me to play and to play against. But if what you're trying to do is play a very competitive style of the game, you'll find that some of your games will just not go your way, and it's not because of any tactical blunder, it's just because you didn't have enough models to make up for some early bad dice rolls. Continuing on with the list of elite armies, we will now move on to the Grey Knights. In order to understand the Grey Knights, we have to bring together 2 concepts that I've spoken about earlier. First being Space Marines, those genetically altered superhumans, and second of all being the Psychers, the futuristic space magicians. The Grey Knights are a group of Space Marine Psychers, whose job it is to hunt down and destroy demons. They are secretive, and few know that they actually exist, but they are the hammer of the Emperor, brought down onto the forces of chaos. With a mixture of tactical combat, tricky teleportations, and brute force magic, they are a force to be reckoned with. Yes, once again we are talking about a highly elite army. While some of these units are close to the cost of normal Space Marines, each and every one of them also has the power of Psychers, so they tend to be costed up a bit more. The Grey Knights infantry, known as the Strike Squad, can come in squads of 10, but for the cost of 240 points, meaning if you were to fill a full complement of 6 units, it would cost you a little bit over 1,400 points to bring them. And so, once again, we are in a situation where, while you're able to bring 60 models, this is going to eat up nearly 3/4 of your army. The Grey Knights have had a bit of a weird history. In 10th edition, which is the edition of the tabletop game of 40k that we're currently in, the developers have done a good job of making them a force that is competitive across the board. However, in previous editions, and unfortunately it might be possible in future editions, the Grey Knights were hyper-focused at only being really good against demons, and not that great against every other type of army. The Grey Knights are a bit unorthodox as an army in how they play. They draw together a little bit of different elements from other armies that those armies have tons of. They have similar armor and weapon styles to Space Marines, but have some psychic elements that are reminiscent of some of the more mystical races like Eldar, which we will talk about when we get to the Xeno section. In addition to that, they also have, in 10th edition, the ability to teleport, which enables them to be picked up and dropped down around the board at regular intervals. They also have Dread Knights, which are their own form of Dreadnoughts, although, in my opinion, much more stupid looking. Downsides of playing Grey Knights in 10th edition are somewhat few and far between. A number of Grey Knight abilities And Grey Knight units are quite powerful. Being an elite army means you don't necessarily need to collect an enormous amount of them, and the myriad of firepower and psychic abilities tends to give variety in the units that you do select. Some smaller downsides might be the fact that, at the time of recording, it's a fairly old model range. They haven't received an update for a while, but who knows, maybe they'll get that refresh soon. Also, it is fairly limited in model range, although with mostly elite armies, that tends to be the case. One potential downside that is not currently the case is what I mentioned earlier, that in previous editions, Grey Knights seem to get a bit left in the wind, but fortunately, we're past that now. Hopefully for good. Well now, after covering the initial Horde army and moving straight into the elites, we're going to go back to the Horde. Maybe. Now we will be covering the Adeptus Mechanicus, and this might be a bit of a weird one, just because the Mechanicus itself is in a bit of an interesting spot in 10th edition. Lore-wise, the Adeptus Mechanicus is the priesthood of Mars, men who worship the Omnissiah, the god of all machines. Possessed by the core belief that the flesh is weak, they exchange their body parts with mechanical augmentations. It is from the planet of Mars that the Imperium gets the vast majority of its weapons and armor, as well as those Imperial Knights I mentioned before. Desiring the preservation of knowledge, the Mechanicus bless machines with holy oils and activate them through rituals. Probably the best way to explain how the Mechanicus treats its machines is if you tried to imagine turning on your car, but instead of getting in and inserting the key and turning the key in the ignition, you instead spend 3 hours marching around in a circle around your car, singing hymns to it while burning incense. Then, you step into your car while 3 other people rub holy oil all over the tires. And then, with a final offertory declaration, the car just suddenly starts. That's the Mechanicus. If we go to the core infantry example again and look at the front line brought by the Mechanicus, we will see the Scutari coming in squads of 10 Rangers, costing just 85 points. For 60 models on the board, putting you just over a quarter of your army. This would make them closer to the Horde style. However, the Adeptus Mechanicus has rarely truly been a Horde army. For example, many of their elite-type units in 10th edition are good, but receive benefits and bonuses depending on if they are close to an infantry unit. So it would seem that players are encouraged to bring elite, high-cost Mechanicus units with a few infantry models nearby to give them bonuses. To add to the complexity, the Mechanicus has a great number of characters, and each character is designed to go with a different, specific type of model, including one character known as the Datasmith, which can only go with a very particular type of elite unit. As a result, what ends up occurring is an army which could be a Horde army if you just ran tons and tons of Scutari, or could be a hyper-elite army if you brought a lot of massive robots. I'd love to say that an army with the title Mechanicus has a large number of tanks, but unfortunately the actual vehicle lineup is a bit slim for the Mechanicus, and so while being able to bring a Horde army, you're not necessarily encouraged to do so. While being able to bring a hyper-elite army, you're actually nerfed if you don't bring sufficient numbers of Horde units. And if you want to bring an armored convoy, you're kind of limited in choice. This is not to paint the Adeptus Mechanicus in a bad light by any means. As someone who has played against this army multiple times, it is something to be feared. Numerous high-powered weapons and devastating salvos are paired with reasonable defense, if somewhat weaker constitutions. A number of very impressive combos can be made, and a number of very useful detachment abilities can add some extra punch. If I was to summarize the way Mechanicus plays, it would be to tie it into, unfortunately, one of its downsides. To play the Mechanicus, you should have a solid grasp on how to play tabletop strategy wargames. A lot of it relies on strategically placing units in ideal locations and strategically using once-per-game abilities at the exact moment they're needed. This is to be placed next to another downside of the Mechanicus, which is For the limited, and in many cases older models in the range, they're unfortunately priced at some of the most expensive amounts. This is mainly due to the sheer amount of detail required for them and the number of extra appendages and extra arms and extra antenna and extra radios and binoculars and all various mechanical elements which are just hardwired into their bodies. Perhaps it's this, or perhaps it's another reason. What is absolutely the case is that the Mechanicus, if you decided to build them in the more horde style, will be a remarkably pricey army to build. The next army we will talk about is the Adeptus Sororitas, or better known as the Sisters of Battle. Now, full disclosure, before I begin this one, I have, out of all the factions of the Imperium, probably the least first-hand experience about this one. Even worse than that, while I've never played against the Custodes or with the Custodes, I can look at their datasheets, because there's not many of them, and figure out pretty easily the way the army works or the problems the army might have. In the case of the Sisters of Battle, they actually have a good number of models and a fair amount of spread of how those models are costed point-wise and what they can do. Lore-wise, the Sisters are a predominantly all-female faction. The only males ever to join them are those who have committed grave evils against the Imperium and are now forced to run armorless into the battle to die in penance for their evil deeds. The Sisters of Battle are the classic meme of nuns with shotguns. Devout believers, truly faithful followers of the God Emperor of mankind who face the enemies of man with fire and faith, blade, and bolter. For context, if you're not used to 40k, bolter is the type of weapon that pretty much every Imperial warrior above an Imperial Guard uses. The Sisters of Battle are known to have such faith and fervor that their prayers actually respond with incredible miracles, whether it be miraculous healing, or calling down blasts of fire, or whatever else. This is not to be confused with them being psychers. Very few, if any, sisters ever have psychic powers. It is their faith in the God Emperor, which seems to call forth his attention and his power. When it comes to the tabletop, from what I understand, and again, I'll be a little bit limited in my knowledge here, there seems to be a fair mixture of both elite and horde possibility within the Sisterhood. If you go with the sort of sacrificial religious fervor example, whether it be the Repentia or the Arcoflagellants, you're able to bring quite a few models, I believe somewhere in the range of 150 to 180 points for both of the units I just mentioned, and you'll be bringing them in 10 models apiece. Even if you wanted to go with the more traditional militaristic organizational route, the Sisterhood, if you take the normal, regular infantry, like we talked about before, in the case of the Sisterhood, it's the Battle Sisters unit, you would bring 10 models and it would only cost you 105 points. It's more elite than the Imperial Guard, but less elite than the Space Marines. Now, the Sisters of Battle do have a number of highly elite units, but I think I would still put them more on the side of larger number of models with the capacity to bring a couple elite units along the way. Now, the last army to be covered is questionable if it's even an army, but I will talk about it just because it does have an army rule. The Imperial Agents army is more of an accessory to other armies, if I'm going to be honest. Its main rule is that any number of the Imperial Agents units can be included in any other Imperial army up to a certain number of points. This means in any given Imperial Guard, or Space Marine, or Sisters of Battle, or Custodian army, or even Imperial Knights, you're able to bring a set number of Imperial Inquisitors. In the lore, the Imperial Inquisition are the Emperor's investigators. They go throughout the realm, making sure that all heresy is destroyed, all mutants are purified, and all treachery is routed. They have unquestionable authority, and tend to shoot first and psychically interrogate your corpse afterwards. On the tabletop, again, because they're more of a supplement to other factions, you can bring 2,000 points of pure Imperial Agents, but even in that case, it encourages you to bring 500 points of at least another army. For example, if you go with units about the Ordo Xenos, the inquisitorial agents who are designed to hunt down aliens, it encourages you to bring the Death Watch along, which is a subset of Space Marines whose rules specialize in defeating aliens. If you wish to bring the inquisitorial agent models which specialize in hunting demons, it encourages you to bring 500 points of Grey Knights. it's less of a specific faction and more of a bunch of different types of factions and types of units which are brought together in a weird hodgepodge. The main famous units of this army are the 4 Assassins, 4 units, each of them being 1 model apiece, fairly expensive and fairly elite. Each one specializes in different things, whether it be sniping infantry, or just ripping and tearing, or infiltrating the enemy lines. They all have their own use, and you can often find people, especially if they're playing hyper-elite armies like Imperial Knights, bringing 1 or 2 of these assassins along just to try to give them options and a unique threat on the board. And so there we have it. This is the Imperium of Man section of the factions of 40k. Now, again, in case I haven't stated this enough throughout these first 2 videos, this is meant to be a very, very brief look. If any of these factions interest you, I would encourage you to look at their model range and take a look at the lore to get a deeper sense. If this little taster got you interested, dive in and drink deep. 40k has some fascinating lore and some great written characters in this world. Other than that, thanks for watching. If you like this content and wish to catch our following videos, please subscribe, and if what you're looking for is less of an instructional video and more seeing the game in action, please check out our numerous narrative battle reports here on the channel. Farewell.